Welcome to Echoes of the Past. Tonight we journey back to one of the darkest chapters in American history. A wagon train of ordinary families chasing the dream of California would instead face starvation, betrayal, and the unthinkable in the frozen Sierra Nevada. This is not just a story of pioneers, it is a story of survival at any cost. Stay with us as we uncover the haunting tale of the Donner Party, America's darkest journey west. Snowflakes drift silently against the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada. Beneath them lies a lonely lake, its surface locked in ice. Along its shore, a handful of crude cabins sit buried under snowdrifts taller than the roofs. Inside, families huddle together in the dark. Their food is gone, their strength is failing, and their dreams of a new life in California have turned into a nightmare that will forever stain American history. This was the Donner Party, an ordinary group of pioneers who dared to chase the promise of the West, only to become trapped in a story of hunger, betrayal, and survival at any cost. But their tragedy did not begin in the mountains. It began with a dream. In the mid-1840s, America was a nation obsessed with expansion. The phrase "manifest destiny" filled the newspapers, a belief that it was the country's divine mission to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. California, with its fertile valleys and mild climate, seemed like a paradise waiting to be claimed. For farmers, merchants, and families struggling back east, the promise of California was irresistible. In the spring of 1846, nearly 500 wagons would set out along the Oregon and California trails. Among them were two prominent families, the Reeds and the Donners. George Donner was 60 years old, a respected farmer from Illinois, traveling with his wife Tamsin and their children. With them rode James Reed, an ambitious businessman with big dreams of fortune in California. Together they organized a wagon train of friends, relatives, and hired hands. Their plan was simple: follow the established Oregon Trail, then branch south into California. The journey would be grueling, over 2,000 miles across plains, deserts, and mountains, but thousands had already done it. If they left in spring, they would arrive before the first winter snow. At least that was the plan. On April 14, 1846, the Donner and Reed families left Springfield, Illinois, their wagons heavy with flour, bacon, and dried beans. Children laughed as they waved goodbye to their neighbors. Horses strained against the weight of the covered wagons, and oxen plodded forward under the spring sun. In those early weeks, spirits were high. The prairie grass was green, the rivers still shallow enough to cross. Each night, wagons circled together for safety, and campfires filled the air with smoke and the smell of frying bacon. It felt less like a march into danger and more like an adventure. But beneath the optimism, there was already risk. The caravan left later than most wagon trains. Every lost day would matter once winter came. Still, no one worried. California awaited them, and the future seemed bright. As the weeks dragged on, the pioneers encountered hardships: broken wagon wheels, sickness, and swollen rivers. But the real turning point came when they reached Fort Bridger, a remote outpost in what is now Wyoming. It was here they first heard of a supposed shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff. A newly promoted route. It was advertised by a man named Lansford Hastings as a faster way to California, saving up to 300 miles. His guidebook promised fertile lands and easy passage. James Reed, ambitious and eager, was convinced. He pushed the group to take the new trail. Others hesitated. The Hastings Cutoff was untested. Rumors said the route crossed mountains and deserts. But time was slipping away, and the idea of saving weeks of travel was too tempting. So in late July, the Donner Party made the fateful choice. They would leave the well-worn Oregon Trail and trust Hastings' unproven path. At first it seemed manageable, but soon the shortcut revealed its true cost. The Wasatch Mountains loomed ahead, their slopes choked with dense forests and jagged rocks. What Hastings had called a shortcut was, in reality, a brutal detour. The wagons crawled forward, sometimes only a mile a day. Men spent hours hacking through trees and blasting rock to clear a passage. Women and children trudged beside the oxen, exhausted and thirsty. Supplies began to dwindle. Tempers flared. The shortcut had already cost them precious weeks, and the hardest part of the journey still lay ahead. As the Donner Party pushed onward, they could not know that winter was gathering strength in the mountains. They could not know that their decision at Fort Bridger would lead them into the jaws of one of America's darkest tragedies. The snow was waiting. The shortcut that was supposed to save the Donner Party time had already cost them dearly. Weeks were wasted hacking through the Wasatch Mountains, where wagons were forced over steep cliffs and through dense forests. The trail was so rough that men collapsed from exhaustion, and oxen broke down under the strain. By the time they emerged from the mountains, the pioneers were already behind schedule and dangerously low on supplies. Ahead of them stretched the Great Salt Lake Desert, a barren expanse of blinding white salt and scorching heat. Hastings had promised it would be easy to cross in just 2 days. In truth, it was nearly 80 miles of pure wasteland with no water, no grass, and no relief from the blazing sun. The Donner Party pushed forward, but soon the oxen began to collapse. Wagons were abandoned one by one, left scattered across the salt flats like skeletons. The animals that survived grew weak without water. Children cried from thirst, their lips cracked and swollen. For 5 days they stumbled across the desert, their shoes melting on the salt, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. When they finally reached the far side, the toll was devastating. Dozens of oxen had perished, wagons were ruined, and tempers had exploded into violence. At one point, James Reed quarreled with another man, and in a fit of rage, Reed killed him with a knife. The wagon train voted to banish Reed from the group. Exiled, he rode ahead alone toward California, while his family was forced to continue without him. The party was now split by mistrust and grief. Their supplies were nearly gone, and the shortcut had cost them not days, but an entire month. By the time they rejoined the main California trail, it was already late September. This was the most dangerous moment of their journey. Wagon trains that had left on time were already crossing the Sierra Nevada, safe from the coming winter. But the Donner Party was still hundreds of miles away. Every day lost brought them closer to disaster. The pioneers pressed onward, their oxen gaunt, their wagons battered. The once cheerful caravan was now a weary, suspicious band of survivors. They crossed deserts, climbed rocky passes, and pushed themselves beyond endurance. By the time they reached the eastern edge of the Sierra Nevada, snow clouds were already gathering on the horizon. The mountains loomed dark and cold, their passes narrow and steep. If the party could cross quickly, California still lay within reach. But time was no longer on their side. The first flakes of snow were falling. And in the high peaks of the Sierra, winter was about to close its iron gate. The Sierra Nevada rose like a wall before the Donner Party. Sharp ridges cut the horizon, and snow already dusted the peaks. But the families still believed they could make it through. They pressed onward, urging their weary oxen up the narrow mountain trail. At first, the snow was light. Wagons creaked and slid on the icy ground, but the pioneers pushed forward with determination. Then, in late October, the storm struck. Within hours, the trail vanished beneath drifts that climbed higher than the wagon wheels. The pass was sealed, and no amount of digging could open it. The Donner Party was trapped. Desperation set in quickly. The group built crude shelters near Truckee Lake, later known as Donner Lake. Logs and branches were dragged together to form rough cabins, their walls thin against the mountain winds. Others camped in tents or tried to sleep under wagons. The snow did not stop falling. It piled higher each day, burying the camp in silence. Food dwindled. Oxen that had survived the desert were slaughtered for meat, but even that supply quickly ran out. Families boiled hides to make a bitter, glue-like soup. Children chewed on leather straps just to trick their bodies into feeling full. Hunger gnawed at them, weakening muscles and darkening thoughts. The cold was merciless. Nights dropped below freezing, and the cabins shook with every storm. Smoke stung their eyes as fires burned low. Mothers clutched their children to keep them warm, whispering prayers into the darkness. The laughter and hope that had filled the early days of the journey were gone. Tensions within the camp worsened. Arguments flared over scraps of food, and old resentments grew sharper. Without Reed to lead, the group lacked unity. Some accused others of hoarding supplies. Trust was dissolving just as quickly as their strength. Weeks dragged by. The snow deepened, cutting them off from escape. Hunting was hopeless. The mountains were silent, no game to be found. The once strong oxen bones were cracked open for marrow. Even tree bark was stripped away. At Truckee Lake, death became a daily companion. The weakest grew pale and thin, collapsing in the cabins or beside the dying fires. Burials were impossible in the frozen ground, so bodies lay covered in snow, silent reminders of what hunger could do. Still, some clung to hope. They believed if a small group could break free, they might reach California and return with help. It would be dangerous. It would mean walking through the mountains on foot, with little food and no shelter. But it was their only chance. So in December, after weeks of misery, a group of 15 set out. They would become known as the Forlorn Hope. Wrapped in scraps of blankets and carrying what little food remained, they trudged into the snow, leaving behind the dying camp at Donner Lake. Behind them, families watched in silence, praying the mountains would not swallow their loved ones whole. The camp was left waiting, starving, weakening, slowly slipping into despair. And for those who marched into the wilderness, the darkest chapter was just beginning. The Forlorn Hope set out into the white silence of the Sierra Nevada, 15 souls stumbling through drifts taller than their bodies. They carried scraps of dried meat and meager supplies, but within days the food was gone. Snow blinded their eyes, freezing winds cut through their rags, and hunger hollowed them from the inside out. At night they huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in faint clouds. Frost clung to their hair and clothes. Feet turned black with frostbite, blistered and raw. The mountains stretched endlessly before them, a maze of peaks and valleys with no clear path forward. One by one, the weakest began to collapse. Some begged the others to leave them behind, too weak to take another step. Death became inevitable, and with death came a choice no one dared to speak aloud. When the first bodies froze in the snow, the survivors stared at them in silence. Days without food had broken their will. Finally, they crossed the unthinkable line. Flesh was cut from the dead and roasted over small fires. They told themselves it was survival, that it was necessary. Still, the shame burned as much as the hunger, but hunger has no conscience. The Forlorn Hope pressed forward, fueled by desperation and the very bodies of their companions. Rumors spread later that some deaths were not natural, that in the madness of starvation some may have been murdered for food. The truth was buried under the snow, and only the survivors knew what really happened. After more than a month of struggle, only 7 staggered out of the wilderness and reached safety. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies skeletal, and their eyes hollow from what they had endured. But they carried news. Dozens were still alive, trapped in the mountains. Rescue parties would need to come if there was any hope left. Back at Donner Lake, the scene was no less grim. The families still trapped were wasting away. The cabin stank of sickness and smoke. Children cried weakly in the darkness, too frail to stand. The dead lay outside, frozen beneath the snow. At first, the survivors tried to hold on without crossing that same terrible line. But as weeks dragged on, and starvation clawed at their minds, the same choice confronted them. Some began to eat the flesh of the dead. It was done in silence behind cabin walls, whispered about but never openly admitted. Mothers fed their starving children with trembling hands. Husbands wept as they cut into the bodies of those who had once been neighbors and friends. The line between survival and horror had vanished. By February, the camp had endured nearly 3 months of hell. Then at last, figures appeared on the horizon. The first relief party had arrived. But salvation was not simple. The rescuers were horrified by what they found. Starving children, bodies half consumed, men and women on the brink of madness. They could only take a handful back with them, leaving the rest behind with promises to return. For the Donner Party, hope had returned, but so had the shame. The world would soon know their secret, and not all of them would live to see the spring. When the first relief party left Donner Lake in February, they carried a handful of survivors out of the snowbound camps, but dozens still remained behind. Too weak to travel, clinging to life in the frozen cabins, the rescuers promised to return. For those left behind, the waiting was agony. In March, the second relief party fought its way through the mountains. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. Children with hollow eyes, adults so weak they could barely stand, and bodies, some partially consumed, stripped for meat. The rescuers tried not to stare, but the truth was clear. The pioneers had done whatever it took to survive. Still, not all could be saved. Some were too frail to walk. Others refused to leave the bodies of their loved ones. When the rescuers departed, more were left behind. The storm did not relent. By the time the third and fourth relief parties arrived, spring was approaching. Snow was melting, but so were the final hopes of those still alive. In the last cabins, rescuers found scenes so grim that some would never speak of them again. bones scattered near cooking fires, flesh cut neatly from corpses, and survivors who admitted in shame and tears that they had eaten human flesh to keep breathing. When the last survivor was carried out in April, the nightmare of the Donner Party finally ended. Of the 87 pioneers who had set out for California, only 48 survived. Nearly half had perished in the mountains. The story spread quickly across America. Newspapers told of starvation, exile, and cannibalism. Some portrayed the pioneers as victims of fate. Others condemned them as monsters. For the survivors, the truth was far more complicated. They were not heroes nor villains. They were people, ordinary families caught in an impossible choice. James Reed, the man once exiled, had returned as a rescuer and saved his wife and children. George Donner, the elder leader, died in the snow, while his wife Tamsin chose to remain with his body rather than abandon him. Their children lived, carried out by strangers. The Donner Party became a legend, a cautionary tale of ambition, miscalculation, and human desperation. The name itself would forever be whispered with dread. But beyond the horror lies a deeper truth. The Donner Party's tragedy was not only about cannibalism, it was about the price of survival, the unforgiving power of nature, and the thin line that separates hope from despair. As the wagons rusted away at Donner Lake, and the spring thaw washed over the mountains, the world moved on. But for those who lived through that terrible winter, the memories never faded. Every snowfall, every cold night was a reminder of the cost of chasing the dream of the West. The snow had taken their strength, their loved ones, and their innocence. What remained was a story that would haunt American history forever. The Donner Party left Illinois with hope and ambition. They reached the Sierra Nevada with nothing but hunger and despair. Of the 87 who began the journey, only 48 survived. Their story has become legend, forever etched into the history of the American frontier. If this tale moved you, there are countless more stories hidden in history's shadows. Don't forget to like this video, share it with friends who love history, and subscribe to Echoes of the Past for more journeys into the past. Because history is never just about dates and names. It's about people, choices, and the price we pay for survival.